They never expected the world to question their right to be there. Elijah Carter and his 12-year-old sister, Naomi, boarded that flight with nothing but excitement: first-class seats, a smooth trip home, the simple luxury of belonging. But before the plane could even take off, their presence was challenge, a flight attendant's scrutinizing gaze, a demand to step out, a silent plane full of passengers who watched and said nothing. Humiliation, doubt, power shifting hands. But what happens when the people you underestimate are the ones who hold the real power? Because what that flight attendant didn't know, what no one on that plane realized, was that these two weren't just any passengers. Their father owned the airline. And by the time this flight landed, the people responsible wouldn't just regret their mistake. They would wish they had never made it. Where are you watching from today? Comment below, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's get into the story. Airports are strange places. They hum with the energy of transition, people moving towards something, away from something, caught somewhere in between. They are places where everyone is a traveler, where money buys comfort and class determines ease. But in this world, even when all things appear equal, some still find their belonging questioned. That morning, Elijah Carter and his 12-year-old sister, Naomi, were moving towards something, toward comfort, toward the rare indulgence of first-class seats their father had arranged for them. It wasn't their usual way of traveling, but it wasn't something they were unfamiliar with either. Their father, Nathaniel Carter, was a man of stature, a businessman whose name carried weight. He had made sure his children understood the world they lived in, how it worked, how it could turn on them, and how they must always carry themselves with dignity no matter what. They moved through the airport with the quiet confidence their father had instilled in them. Elijah, 17, carried himself with a maturity beyond his years, his movements measured, his eyes taking in everything. Naomi, still young enough to find excitement in the small luxuries of life, bounced beside him, her fingers gripping the straps of her backpack. "I can't believe we're sitting in first class," she whispered as they reached their gate, eyes shining with anticipation. Elijah smirked. "Don't act too surprised. Dad said we'd get used to it." She grinned, rocking back on her heels as the flight attendant at the boarding door scanned their tickets without a second glance and waved them through. And then they stepped onto the plane. The hush of the first-class cabin wrapped around them, different from the crowded energy of coach. The seats were wider, the lighting softer, the air quieter. It was a world apart, a different universe sealed off by a flimsy curtain. Naomi let out a quiet whoa as she ran her fingers along the smooth leather of her seat. Elijah chuckled, nudging her forward. "Come on, don't embarrass us." They settled in, tucking their bags away. Naomi immediately leaned toward the window, her small fingers brushing against the glass. "I wonder if they have warm cookies," she mused. Elijah shook his head. "It's not a hotel, Naomi." But before Naomi could retort, a shadow darkened their row. It was the flight attendant. She stood over them with a kind of controlled stillness, her uniform crisp, her expression polite, but not warm. She was an older woman, mid-50s, the kind who had worked in first class long enough to feel ownership over it. Elijah noticed it immediately, the way her eyes flickered across them, assessing, the way her lips pressed together in something just shy of a frown. "Excuse me," she said, voice smooth but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Elijah blinked. Naomi looked up, confused. "Yes," he answered, his voice even. "These are ours." He reached for his ticket, holding it out for her to see. The flight attendant, her name tag read M. Whitman, took the slip of paper but did not immediately look at it. Instead, she studied him, then Naomi, as if waiting for them to correct themselves, as if expecting them to realize they had made some kind of mistake. Then, she looked at the ticket. Her eyes scanned the details, and a small, nearly imperceptible tension tightened the corners of her mouth. She handed the tickets back with a measured slowness. "This is first class," she repeated, as though they had somehow misunderstood her the first time. Elijah nodded. "We know." A pause. Then, "Who booked these seats for you?" Elijah's fingers curled slightly against his lap. Naomi stiffened beside him. "Our father," he said, careful, controlled. Whitman hesitated for just a beat too long. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Naomi shifted in her seat, her excitement dimming. "Why did she ask that?" she whispered. Elijah exhaled, staring at the seat in front of him. "I don't know," he said, But he did. The unspoken. It might have ended there. It could have. If they had been someone else, two blonde-haired children. Maybe. Or the sons and daughters of men whose privilege was assumed rather than questioned, then perhaps that would have been the end of it. But 15 minutes later, Whitman was back. This time, she was not alone. Beside her stood Peter Langston, another flight attendant, his presence lending an air of authority to whatever was about to unfold. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with the look of a man who had seen and done it all. But he did not meet Elijah's eyes as he spoke. "We need you both to step out of first class for a moment." Elijah's entire body went rigid. Naomi flinched. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. Langston's voice was neutral, but too carefully so. "We just need to verify something with your tickets." Elijah knew the game now. He had seen it before. Felt its edges pressing against him in grocery stores. In department stores. In places where he had done nothing wrong but still found himself watched. He forced himself to remain calm. "We already showed them. It's just a quick check." Langston avoided his gaze. "Please come with us." Naomi's excitement was gone now. Replaced by something smaller. Something fragile. Her fingers curled around the edge of the armrest. "Why do we have to move?" she asked. Whisper soft. Whitman folded her arms across her chest. "We can do this the easy way," she said, voice cooling. "Or we can call security." The weight of the words settled between them like a hammer against glass. Naomi looked up at Elijah. Her eyes wide, searching for reassurance, for something to tell her this wasn't what it felt like. Elijah felt something inside him harden. He could feel them now, the eyes. The other passengers, watching but saying nothing, heads turned, whispers forming at the edges of the moment. And yet, no one spoke. No one said, "Hey, they've already shown their tickets." No one said, "Why are you only checking them?" No one said anything at all. Elijah forced himself to breathe, to keep his voice steady. "Come on, Naomi," he murmured. "Let's go." She hesitated, but in the end, she obeyed. The walk down the aisle was slow. Excruciating. He felt it in his bones. The weight of being made an example of. The quiet shame of it. The way his sister clutched her backpack as if trying to disappear. The moment they stepped off the plane, the doors closed behind them. A uniformed security officer stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching them the way one watches a problem that needs to be dealt with. Elijah reached for his phone, his hands shaking. He scrolled to his father's number, pressing the call button. The line rang once, twice. Then, his father's voice, low and measured. "Son?" Elijah swallowed. His voice came out unsteady. "They just kicked us off the plane." Silence. Then, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, "Who did?" Elijah turned slightly, looking back at the plane that had just shut them out. The flight crew. Another pause. But this time, it wasn't confusion. It was something colder. "Stay where you are," his father said. His tone was unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone." A beat of silence. "I'll handle this." Elijah stood in the middle of the terminal, his phone still gripped in his hand. His father's words hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. "Stay where you are. Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." Naomi stood beside him, small and stiff, gripping the straps of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. They had not caused a scene. They had not raised their voices. They had not argued. And yet, here they were standing outside the plane while their first-class seats sat empty. Elijah felt something settle into his chest. Something heavy and bitter. He had been taught to prepare for this kind of moment. Told what it meant to be young and black in America. Warned that there would be times when he would not be seen as an individual but as a problem. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things. The airport hummed with indifference. People walked past them, heads down, eyes skimming over them like they weren't even there. A man in a business suit barely spared them a glance before striding toward his gate. A woman dragging a small child by the hand glanced their way and then quickly looked away. As if their presence was something to be politely ignored. The uniformed security officer standing nearby didn't speak, didn't move, just kept them in his periphery waiting, watching. Naomi finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Elijah exhaled through his nose, his hands tightening into fists before he forced them to relax. He hated how young she sounded, how unsure. He turned toward her, kneeling slightly so that they were eye level. "Dad's handling it." She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. And why would she be? The world had already told her. In so many ways, that fairness wasn't something guaranteed. Elijah straightened just as the intercom crackled to life. Marjorie Whitman, please report to the front desk immediately. Elijah's head snapped up. Naomi's eyes went wide. The security officer shifted slightly, glancing toward the gate desk. His expression still unreadable. Do you think? Naomi trailed off. Elijah didn't answer. But he knew. Something was happening. And Marjorie Whitman wasn't ready for it. The awakening of consequence. Marjorie Whitman walked through the airport with measured steps. Her posture as straight and polished as it had been for years. She had served in first-class cabins long enough to know how to handle difficult passengers. To diffuse situations before they escalated. But something about this felt different. The call to the gate desk had been unexpected. Public. She didn't like it. She arrived to find Richard Denton, the gate supervisor, waiting for her. He was a serious man. All efficiency and no wasted words. His expression, tight-lipped and unreadable, was enough to send a prickle of unease down her spine. You needed me? She asked, keeping her voice light, professional. Denton didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, nodding toward the side entrance where an airport official stood holding a phone. The official looked at her, then spoke quietly into the receiver. Yes, sir, she's here now. Marjorie frowned slightly. Who is that? Denton exhaled. We just got a call from corporate. Direct orders from Nathaniel Carter. The name hit her like a slap. She felt it before she could fully process it, the slow, creeping realization that this was not just a passenger complaint. Not just a misunderstanding she could explain away with the right words and the right tone. Because Nathaniel Carter wasn't just another frequent flyer. Nathaniel Carter owned the airline. Her stomach twisted. Denton's expression remained neutral, but there was something knowing in his eyes as he continued. Apparently, the two kids you removed from first class? Their father is waiting on an explanation. A strange silence stretched between them. For the first time in a long time, Marjorie Whitman had no words. The weight of judgment. Naomi swung her legs as she sat on the hard plastic airport seat, her fingers picking absently at a loose thread on her hoodie. Elijah stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the entrance to the gate. Then, the moment came. Marjorie Whitman appeared. She walked toward them with that same controlled elegance. But there was something missing now, the quiet, self-assured authority, the certainty that she was in charge. This was not a woman who had decided to correct a mistake. This was a woman who had been told to. She stopped in front of them, clearing her throat. There has been an oversight, she said. Naomi looked up at her. Elijah said nothing. Marjorie's jaw tightened slightly, but she forced herself to continue. After reviewing the seating arrangements, we have confirmed that your tickets are, in fact, correct. You are welcome to return to your first-class seats. Elijah held her gaze, his pulse slow and steady. He could feel Naomi watching him, waiting for his lead. Finally, he spoke. I want to hear you say it. Marjorie blinked. Excuse me? Elijah exhaled through his nose. You assumed we didn't belong, he said, his voice quiet but sharp. I want to hear you admit it. A flicker of something resentment. Embarrassment crossed her face. Passengers were watching now. Conversations had quieted. Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line. I made an assumption, she said, measured, controlled, and I was wrong. Elijah let the silence settle between them before finally nodding. Okay. Marjorie's nostrils flared slightly, but she turned sharply on her heel, motioning for them to follow. Naomi glanced at Elijah before grabbing her backpack and standing. As they walked back toward the plane, Naomi leaned in slightly. She didn't mean that, she whispered. Elijah smirked. I know. The return. The first-class cabin felt different now. Passengers who had ignored them before were suddenly paying attention. Some shifted in their seats, embarrassed by their own silence. Others watched openly, curiosity in their eyes. They passed a well-dressed man in a tailored suit. He muttered, just loud enough to be heard. It's about time. Marjorie stiffened, but said nothing. Further ahead, a woman in her 60s, seated near the front, shook her head and murmured, they should have never been asked to leave in the first place. Elijah saw it then, the shift. Marjorie Whitman had spent years in control, dictating the flow of her cabin. But now, she was the one under scrutiny. For the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. Elijah and Naomi settled back into their seats. Marjorie hesitated before speaking. Would you like something to drink before takeoff? Elijah tilted his head slightly. You didn't ask us that when we first sat down. Marjorie's fingers twitched. I'd like to correct that now. Elijah considered her for a long moment. Then, he exhaled. Water for both of us. Marjorie nodded stiffly and walked away. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was weird. Elijah leaned back in his seat. She's not in control anymore. And for Marjorie Whitman, that was the worst part of all. The plane hummed with the low vibration of its engines, settling into the steady rhythm of its ascent. From the outside, it was just another flight, passengers shifting in their seats, adjusting tray tables, scrolling through in-flight movies. But beneath the surface, in the hushed silence of first class, something else had taken root. Tension. A weight, invisible but present, hung thick in the cabin. Elijah sat stiffly, his arms crossed over his chest, his mind replaying every moment that had led them back to this seat. Naomi, beside him, picked at the hem of her sweater, no longer interested in the novelty of flying first class. The magic of it had been stolen from her. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit cleared his throat, then muttered under his breath, just loud enough for them to hear. Unbelievable. Elijah turned his head slightly. But the man didn't meet his gaze. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. He didn't mean unbelievable as in what happened to them was unacceptable. He meant unbelievable as in they shouldn't be here at all. And just like that, the lesson was clear. It didn't matter that their father owned the airline. It didn't matter that their tickets were legitimate. It didn't matter that they had been wronged, humiliated, and then forced to endure a public apology that wasn't really an apology at all. Because in the eyes of men like him, in the eyes of people who had spent their lives believing that first class was their domain, Elijah and Naomi were still intruders. The air felt thick. Naomi tugged at his sleeve. Elijah, she whispered. What? She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him with those wide, searching eyes, as if waiting for him to explain something that had no good explanation. Are we really just supposed to sit here? She murmured. Elijah exhaled, running a hand over his face. That's what they want, he muttered, for us to sit here. To be grateful we got back on at all. Naomi frowned, but we didn't do anything wrong. He smirked, but it wasn't an amused kind of smirk. And that, he said quietly, is the problem. The cost of comfort. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, their expressions carefully neutral, not unfriendly, but distant. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, stopped at their row. She hesitated before speaking. Would you like anything else? A meal, maybe? Elijah glanced up at her. Did you ask everyone else that when they first sat down? He asked. His voice light but sharp. Hannah's expression flickered just for a second before she forced a small nod. No, she admitted. I didn't. Naomi looked between them, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. Elijah studied Hannah for a long moment, then finally exhaled. Water. She nodded, disappearing toward the galley. Naomi tugged at his sleeve again. Why did you ask her that? Elijah shrugged. Because she wants to make things right now. But she didn't do anything when it mattered. Naomi bit her lip. Do you think she means it? Elijah sighed. I don't know. But deep down, he did. She meant it only because she had seen the fallout. She meant it now because it was safe. The intercom call. The minutes dragged. Naomi finally picked a movie on her screen. But Elijah could tell she wasn't really watching it. Her fingers tapped lightly against her armrest. Her mind still tangled in the weight of what had happened. Then, the intercom crackled to life. Marjorie Whitman, please report to the cockpit immediately. A ripple of awareness passed through the cabin. Heads turned. A few passengers glanced toward the front of the plane, exchanging quiet murmurs. Naomi sat up straighter. Again? Elijah smirked. Yeah. Naomi hesitated. What do you think's happening? Elijah tilted his head, watching as Marjorie Whitman stiffened in place before beginning the long walk toward the cockpit. Her movements weren't as sharp as before. There was no longer the quiet air of authority. No certainty in her posture. He leaned back in his seat. I think she's about to learn what it feels like to be powerless. The reckoning. The door to the cockpit shut behind her with a quiet click. The enclosed space suddenly felt much smaller than it had before. Captain Reynolds, a seasoned pilot with more years in the air than some of his flight crew had on this earth. sat in his chair, his face unreadable. The intercom phone was on the center console, still connected to the call. And then, a voice. Low, controlled. Marjorie Whitman. Her breath caught. There was no mistaking that voice. It was Nathaniel Carter. I assume you now understand exactly how badly you miscalculated today. Marjorie swallowed. Her palms were damp, but she clasped them together in front of her, forcing herself to keep her composure. Sir, don't bother. The voice on the other end was calm. I'm not interested in excuses. Captain Reynolds said nothing. He was simply there to bear witness. Did you verify my children's tickets before asking them to move? Marjorie hesitated. I was following protocol. Silence. Then, the voice again. That's not what I asked. A lump formed in her throat. No, sir. Another long pause. So you assumed they didn't belong. Her fingers twitched. I misjudged the situation. Did you question any other first-class passengers the same way? Her stomach twisted. She already knew the answer. And so did he. I own this airline, Miss Whitman. Nathaniel Carter continued, his voice eerily even. Which means when a situation like this arises, I have the power to ensure it is handled properly. And believe me, it will be. Marjorie felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like lead. Captain Reynolds finally spoke. His voice was quieter, but there was no mistaking the disappointment laced within it. You didn't just embarrass 2 passengers. Miss Whitman, he said, you embarrassed this airline. Marjorie felt her throat tighten. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. And then, the final blow. Upon landing, security will escort you to the executive office. If your explanation is unsatisfactory, you will no longer be employed by this airline. Her breath hitched. Sir, please. This conversation is over. The line went dead. For the first time in her career, Marjorie Whitman had no control over what happened next. The descent. She stepped out of the cockpit. Her hands clammy. Her legs weaker than she would ever admit. As she made her way back through the first-class cabin, the weight of the passengers' stares pressed down on her. She knew what they were thinking. She had seen that look before but never directed at her. She had wielded power. Now, it had been taken from her. Elijah watched her as she passed. She didn't make eye contact. Naomi shifted in her seat. She looks. Yeah, Elijah murmured. She looked like someone who had just been sentenced. Because she had. The sky outside the window had darkened to an indigo shade, the last remnants of daylight stretching thin against the horizon. Inside the plane, the dimmed cabin lights cast a soft glow over the first-class passengers, illuminating their carefully composed faces, their stolen glances, their quiet murmurs. Marjorie Whitman moved through the aisle like a ghost. Her movements, once crisp and sure, were now mechanical, automatic, as though she were performing a duty she no longer believed in. She had spent years cultivating control over her cabin, control over the passengers, control over the invisible rules that governed first-class travel. But control, she was learning, was a fragile thing. It could be shattered in an instant. And now, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her. Not because she suddenly found herself questioning her actions, but because for the first time, there would be consequences. And that was the thing, wasn't it? People like her had been making assumptions like this for years, had been wielding quiet power over who belonged and who didn't, had been deciding, often with no real thought at all, who deserved comfort and who deserved scrutiny. She had thought she would go home tonight, pour herself a glass of wine, and forget about these 2 children she had removed from their seats. But now, she knew she wouldn't be going home at all. The silence that speaks. Elijah sat still, his fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm against the armrest. Naomi curled up beside him, her body smaller than before, as though the weight of what had happened had pressed her into herself. She had stopped asking questions, stopped fidgeting, stopped peering out the window with excitement. It was the silence that got to him. Not just hers, not just his, but the silence of everyone around them. The passengers in first class, the ones who had watched them be removed and had said nothing, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked at him, then quickly looked away. Some, he suspected, felt guilty. Others just wanted to pretend this had never happened, as though ignoring it would erase their own complicity. And then there were the others, the ones who still thought they didn't belong here. Even now, the ones who wouldn't dare say it aloud, but who carried their resentment in the stiffness of their shoulders. In the way they held their newspapers just a little too high. In the way they had turned their screens to movies they weren't really watching. It was the quietness of it all that made Elijah's stomach twist. Because silence, he knew, was its own kind of violence. It was the sound of a world that had made up its mind about you and didn't feel the need to explain why. Naomi shifted beside him. "I'm not thirsty anymore," she murmured, pushing her untouched glass of water away. Elijah turned his head slightly. "You sure?" She nodded, and for the first time, he noticed how tired she looked. Not sleepy, but tired. The kind of tired that had nothing to do with time zones or long flights. The kind of tired you felt when you realized the world wasn't what you thought it was. And maybe, in some ways, that was the real tragedy of it all. Because it didn't matter how much money their father had. Didn't matter that their seats had been paid for. Didn't matter that they had been right. The truth had already been laid bare. In the eyes of this world, they would always have to prove that they belonged. And even then, it would never be enough. The captain's announcement. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Naomi sat up a little straighter. Elijah exhaled. The flight was almost over. But somehow, he knew the real turbulence hadn't even begun yet. The walk of shame. Marjorie stood at the front of the cabin, near the galley, gripping the edges of a drink cart that had already been secured for landing. Her breathing was steady, but beneath her practiced calm, something inside her was unraveling. She could feel it, the weight of the passengers' eyes on her. The judgment that had shifted directions. When she had removed those two children from their seats, she had done so with complete certainty. She had not hesitated. She had not doubted herself. But now, doubt had sunk into her bones, twisting itself around her ribs like an unfamiliar ache. Because for the first time, she was the one being scrutinized. And for the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. She clenched her jaw, staring ahead, willing the plane to land faster. But it didn't matter. Because as soon as those wheels touched the ground, she knew her fate was already sealed. The final descent. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, rolling steadily down the runway. Around them, first-class passengers began shifting, gathering their things, stretching their legs. The air buzzed with the usual post-flight routine, seatbelts unclicking, luggage being pulled from the overhead bins, tired murmurs about travel plans. But in the front of the cabin, standing just past the jet bridge, was a man who did not look tired. Nathaniel Carter. And beside him, waiting in the crisp, quiet authority of their uniforms, were two security officers. The murmurs stopped. Elijah sat up. Naomi rubbed her eyes. Marjorie, still gripping the drink cart, went rigid. She had known this was coming. But knowing something and feeling it were two different things. Passengers, now curious, now watching, paused in their movements. The ones who had once ignored the scene unfolding in first class were suddenly invested in its conclusion. Because power had shifted hands. And now, it was Marjorie who would be asked to leave. The end of assumptions. The jet bridge door opened. A security officer stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Whitman, you need to come with us." Marjorie's fingers twitched against the fabric of her uniform. She turned slightly, as if looking for a way out, as if searching for someone to step in and save her. No one did. She inhaled sharply, lifted her chin, and took the first step toward the jet bridge. But the whispers followed her. The same way they had followed Elijah and Naomi. The same way judgment always trailed behind those who were made an example of. She walked past Nathaniel Carter without a word. He did not look at her. He did not acknowledge her. Because she was no longer his concern. He turned to his children. Elijah stood, adjusting his bag. Naomi clutched the straps of her backpack. Nathaniel studied them both for a moment. His gaze steady, assessing. "Are you okay?" he asked. Elijah nodded. Naomi hesitated, then nodded too. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted slightly. An exhale. An easing of the shoulders. "Good," he said. Then, without looking back, he placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, gently guided Naomi forward, and led them off the plane. Behind them, Marjorie Whitman disappeared into the crowd. And just like that, the assumption that they didn't belong had come undone. The airport terminal was a machine of movement, faces passing in a blur. The hum of conversation blending with the sharp announcements echoing overhead. It was a place of arrivals and departures, of new beginnings and quiet endings. But for Elijah and Naomi, it was something else. It was a battlefield. Not the kind with bullets or raised voices. Not the kind that made the news. But a battlefield nonetheless. Because what had happened on that plane had not ended when they stepped off. It was still here. In the way people looked at them or didn't. In the way their father stood beside them. Silent but unmoving. His presence a fortress against the world that had tried, so effortlessly, to diminish them. Nathaniel Carter did not rush. He did not look around. He did not acknowledge the growing whispers that followed them as they walked. Because he did not need to. The world had already taken notice. A different kind of power. The passengers from first class trickled into the terminal. Some walking briskly, eager to move on with their lives. Others slowing as they recognized the scene before them. Security officers flanked Marjorie Whitman as she stood to the side. Her posture stiff. Her expression unreadable. She had not spoken since she had been escorted off the plane. She had not asked for understanding. Because she knew there would be none. A man in a Navy suit, Richard Langford, one of the airline's senior executives, stood nearby. Arms crossed. His jaw set. He had been called in directly by corporate. By Nathaniel Carter. This was not a routine debriefing. This was something else. Something bigger. And it was happening in full view of the terminal. Passengers who had ignored the first signs of trouble now lingered at a distance. Pretending to check their phones. Their curiosity outweighing their politeness. Some would say nothing. Some would whisper. And some would go home and tell the story of the woman who had once commanded first class. Only to be escorted away like an unruly passenger. Nathaniel Carter did not look at her. She did not exist to him anymore. Instead, he turned to his children. Elijah. Elijah straightened at the sound of his name. His father's voice low, steady. I need you to understand something. Naomi shifted beside him, silent but listening. Nathaniel's gaze did not waver. They will always think they can take something from you, he said. Your comfort, your dignity, your belonging. Elijah swallowed. His father continued. But what they think and what they can do are two different things. Elijah nodded. It was not an answer. It was a promise. The reckoning. Richard Langford stepped forward. Mr. Carter, he began, voice measured, careful. We're prepared to take immediate action regarding this situation. Nathaniel did not blink. I assume you are. Langford hesitated. The power dynamic had shifted. And he knew it. Marjorie Whitman, for all her years of control, for all her quiet certainty, was now a liability. And Nathaniel Carter was not the kind of man who left things unresolved. Effective immediately, Langford continued, clearing his throat. Ms. Whitman is relieved of her position. There will be a formal review. But given the circumstances, we do not expect. Nathaniel lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm not interested in what you expect, he said, his voice quiet but cutting. I'm interested in what you will do. Langford exhaled, nodding once. She's done. Marjorie flinched. For the first time, she turned to Nathaniel, her lips parting slightly, as if searching for something, an appeal, a defense, an explanation. But there was nothing left to say. She had assumed that she was untouchable. She had assumed that she would be protected. She had assumed that power would shield her from the consequences of her actions. And she had assumed wrong. The lessons we learned too late. Marjorie Whitman did not cry. She did not protest. She simply lowered her gaze, squared her shoulders, and walked away. Not through the gate, not toward another flight, but toward the exit. And just like that, she was gone. The aftermath. Nathaniel Carter exhaled slowly, adjusting his cufflinks as if dusting off the remnants of an unpleasant chore. Elijah, Naomi, both turned to him. Let's go. They followed without question, walking through the airport with the same quiet dignity their father had carried his entire life. Elijah did not look back. He did not need to. The world would remember what had happened today. Not because it was the first time. Not because it would be the last. But because today, the world had been forced to listen. And for once, the world had been forced to see. The airport was behind them now. The tension of the plane. The whispers in first class. The stiff-lipped apologies. The humiliation and the quiet victory, it had all been left in that terminal. Trapped in the artificial air of the jet bridge. But the thing about moments like these, Elijah knew, was that they never truly ended. They lingered. They sank into the bones. They became part of you. The town car was silent as it rolled through the streets of Los Angeles. The city glimmering in the distance. The lights casting long shadows across the windshield. Naomi sat beside him, her small frame curled into herself, her fingers still clutching the straps of her backpack as if holding onto something solid. Something real. Across from them, their father sat still, his profile sharp against the dim glow of the passing streetlights. Nathaniel Carter was not an expressive man. He did not raise his voice. He did not make scenes. His power was quieter than that. And far more dangerous. The unfinished conversation. Elijah broke the silence first. Is that it? Nathaniel's gaze flickered toward him. What do you mean? Elijah shifted. Whitman, she's fired. The airline will do some damage control. People will move on. But is that it? His father studied him for a long moment. His fingers steepled together. No, he said finally. Naomi looked up. Then what happens now? Nathaniel exhaled. He was not a man who liked to explain himself. He was a man who moved pieces across the board without announcing the strategy. But tonight, he looked at his children, really looked, and something in his posture shifted. I need you both to understand something, he said, his voice even, steady. The world operates on assumptions. Who belongs, who deserves, who has power and who does not. And in that world, the only thing more dangerous than a man who has power is a man who was never supposed to have it. Elijah swallowed. Nathaniel continued. That flight attendant? She wasn't afraid of making a mistake. She was afraid of being wrong about who she thought you were. He leaned forward slightly. Because people like her, they live by the belief that the rules they create are the rules of the world. He let the words settle before finishing. And when those rules are broken, they don't apologize. He exhaled. They adjust. Elijah understood. Then, this had never been about an apology. It had never even been about justice. It was about power. And what happens when it shifts into hands it was never meant for. The residue of humiliation. Naomi's voice was quiet when she spoke. I don't like how they looked at us. Elijah glanced at her. Who? She frowned. The other passengers. Elijah did not answer. Because he had seen it too. He had seen the way they had refused to make eye contact as they were escorted off the plane. He had seen the discomfort in their faces when they were brought back on. He had seen the muttered comments, the stolen glances, the quiet resentment that clung to the air. And he had seen something else. Not just discomfort, not just guilt, but anger. Because even after the apology, after the correction, there were still people on that plane who thought that he and Naomi had no right to be there. People who thought that they had somehow won something they did not deserve. And that, Elijah realized, was what stung the most. Not that they had been thrown off the plane. Not that they had been humiliated. But that even after they had been proven right, it still did not feel like a victory. The name that carries weight. The car slowed, pulling up to the gated entrance of their home. The gates opened without hesitation. The weight of their father's name granting them passage. As it always did. Because that was the thing about power. It was not just about wealth. It was about access. It was about doors that opened before you even reached them. It was about the way people spoke carefully when addressing you. About the way entire corporations adjusted themselves around your existence. And yet, even with all of that, a flight attendant had still looked at Elijah and Naomi and decided they did not belong. Nathaniel Carter stepped out of the car first. Elijah followed, his movements slower, heavier. Naomi walked beside him, her small frame still hunched, her grip still firm on her backpack. Their father paused at the door, waiting for them. Elijah. He turned. Nathaniel's gaze was unreadable. What did you learn today? Elijah thought about it. Thought about the way the other passengers had watched them in silence. Thought about the way Whitman had hesitated before she apologized. Thought about the way Hannah, the younger flight attendant, had only spoken up after it was safe to do so. He met his father's gaze. That we can be right, he said quietly, and it still won't matter. Nathaniel nodded. Once. Then, he opened the door. The lesson that remains. That night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Naomi's words echoed in his mind. I don't like how they looked at us. His father's voice followed. The world operates on assumptions. And then, his own realization. We can be right, and it still won't matter. He exhaled slowly, his chest tight. Outside his window, The city stretched endlessly, the skyline flickering against the darkness. The streets alive with the quiet hum of people moving, surviving, pushing forward. Somewhere out there, another Elijah, another Naomi, was learning the same lesson. Because this story? This wasn't the first time it had happened. And it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. The morning after, the world outside their home moved on. Planes still took off. People still rushed through airports, brushing past each other without a second glance. Marjorie Whitman had already begun to fade from the minds of those who had witnessed her downfall, becoming just another name in a quiet scandal. Another lesson in corporate caution. But inside the Carter household, the weight of what had happened had not lifted. Because humiliation lingers. It burrows into the skin, makes a home in the quiet spaces of the mind, settles deep in the places no one else can see. And for Elijah, it had settled in his chest, in his hands, in the way his mind kept replaying the moment they were ordered off the plane, the walk down the aisle. The silence that had swallowed them whole. It had not been anger that had followed them. It had been certainty. The certainty that they had never belonged in the first place. The echo of injustice. Elijah sat at the kitchen counter, staring down at the untouched plate of food in front of him. His father stood by the window, silent, watching the world beyond the glass. Naomi sat across from Elijah, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the marble countertop. It was a quiet house. Not because nothing needed to be said, but because they all knew words would never be enough. Nathaniel finally turned. Elijah. He looked up. Are you angry? Elijah exhaled. He wanted to say no. That it didn't matter. That it was over. But it wasn't. It would never be. Yes, he said finally. Nathaniel nodded, as if this answer was the only one that made sense. Good, he said. Naomi frowned. Good? Nathaniel met Elijah's gaze. Anger is fuel, he said. It's fire. And fire is only dangerous when you don't know how to use it. Elijah swallowed. His father continued. Tell me something, he said. What do you think happened to the other passengers on that plane? Elijah frowned. What do you mean? Nathaniel's expression didn't change. What do you think they told themselves? Naomi shifted. Some of them were uncomfortable. She murmured. Some of them knew it was wrong. Nathaniel nodded. Yes. Then his gaze sharpened. And what did they do? Elijah clenched his jaw. Nothing. Nathaniel exhaled. That, he said, is the world. He stepped toward them. Slow. Deliberate. People will tell themselves all kinds of things to sleep at night. They'll tell themselves it wasn't their place to speak up. That it wasn't their fight. That maybe, just maybe, there was a reason you were asked to leave. Naomi's lips pressed together. But they knew. Yes, Nathaniel said. They knew. And they still said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but heavy. Because knowing has never been enough. The burden of awareness. The day stretched on. Elijah tried to lose himself in distraction, scrolling through his phone, flipping through the channels on the TV, stepping outside to breathe in the fresh air. But no matter where he went, it followed him. That feeling, that knowing. It was in the way the sun felt too bright against his skin. The way his own reflection in the glass felt unfamiliar. The way his mind kept returning to the passengers who had watched it all happen. Not to Marjorie Whitman, not even to the men in suits who had dismissed them so easily. But to the ones who had said nothing. Because they were the ones who made it possible. Not just that day, but every day. The quiet resistance. That evening, Nathaniel called Elijah into his study. Elijah sat across from him. The room lined with books. The faint scent of old paper and polished wood in the air. Nathaniel rested his hands on the desk. I need you to understand something, he said. Elijah nodded. I know. But Nathaniel shook his head. No, he said. You don't. Elijah frowned. His father studied him. You think power is about winning, he said. About proving people wrong. About showing them who you are. Elijah stiffened but said nothing. Nathaniel exhaled. Power, he said, is about never having to prove anything at all. Elijah's breath caught. His father leaned back slightly. Do you think those men in first class, those men who looked at you like you didn't belong, do you think they have ever had to prove they deserve to sit there? Elijah clenched his fists. No. Nathaniel nodded. That is the difference, he said. That is what they are afraid of losing. And that is what you will spend your life fighting against. Silence settled between them. Then, Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. You will not win by yelling. Elijah swallowed. You will not win by proving them wrong. His father exhaled. "You will win," he said, "when they no longer question whether you belong at all. The fire that will not die." That night, Elijah could not sleep. The words echoed in his mind. Power is about never having to prove anything at all. He thought about Naomi, about the way she had shrunk into herself on that plane. He thought about the passengers who had looked away. And then he thought about his father. Nathaniel Carter had never raised his voice. He had never demanded anything. And yet, his presence alone had been enough to send a woman into exile. Because the world had already adjusted itself around him. And that was the real fight. Not just to be right. Not just to be allowed in the room. But to walk in and have no one question why you were there in the first place. Elijah exhaled, turning over in bed. Tomorrow, he knew, the world would continue as it always had. But tomorrow, he would walk differently. Tomorrow, he would speak differently. Tomorrow, he would carry himself with the knowledge that his existence alone was an act of defiance. Because the world had tried to remove him. And still, he was here. The world outside did not change. The sun rose the same way it always did, spilling golden light over the rooftops, warming the streets, bathing the city in the illusion of a fresh start. But inside Elijah Carter, something had shifted. It had begun the moment he and Naomi had been asked to leave their seats. It had been sharpened in the silence of first class. It had solidified in the way his father had moved through that airport, not with rage, not with noise, but with the certainty of a man who understood something deeper than anger. Power. And how easily it could be taken. Or taken back. The resurfacing of memory. At school that morning, Elijah felt it in the way people looked at him. It wasn't that they knew what had happened. It wasn't that they had seen the plane. The flight attendant's forced apology. The weight of being stripped of dignity and then reluctantly handed it back. It was something else. Something unspoken. The way a teacher glanced at him for a moment too long before continuing a lesson. The way a classmate hesitated before speaking to him. The way some people smiled just a little too much, while others pretended he wasn't there at all. He had always known what it felt like to be noticed. But now, he understood what it meant to be watched. Because that was the real lesson, wasn't it? It wasn't about what had happened on the plane. It was about what would happen next. About how many more times he would have to defend his presence in a room. In a conversation. In a space that was never meant for him. It was about what it meant to carry that weight. And whether he would let it crush him. The conversation that does not end. At lunch, he found himself sitting alone. He wasn't sure when it had happened. One moment, the cafeteria had been buzzing around him. And the next, he was alone at his table, watching the way people moved around him rather than toward him. Then, a voice. Elijah. He looked up. It was David Michaels. Elijah had known David since middle school. They were not close, but they were not strangers. David was the kind of person who always seemed to exist just outside of things. Watching, half involved, never quite willing to take a side. But today, he had chosen a side simply by walking over. Elijah tilted his head. "Yeah?" David hesitated. Then, finally, "I saw." Elijah's stomach tightened. "Saw what?" David exhaled. "The video." Elijah went still. "The flight?" David nodded. "It's everywhere. Man." Elijah clenched his jaw. He should have expected it. A scandal like that, people don't just witness things like that anymore. They record them. They post them. They dissect them in comment sections. Turn them into hashtags. Use them as proof of whatever argument they've already decided is true. Elijah reached for his phone, unlocking it with a swipe of his thumb. And there it was. A shaky cell phone recording. His own voice. Calm but firm. "Say it." The flight attendant's hesitation. "You assumed we didn't belong." The whispers in the background. The silent weight of watching. The shift in power. And beneath the video, the flood of comments. Some, outraged. "Unbelievable. This is why we say racism is still alive." Some, dismissive. "She was just doing her job. Why does everything have to be about race?" Some, worse. "If they hadn't acted so entitled, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Elijah inhaled sharply. David shifted. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. "For what happened?" Elijah looked at him. "And what are you sorry for?" David blinked. Elijah set his phone down. "You didn't do anything." David hesitated. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Elijah studied him. Then, he nodded. "Yes." David sat down. And for the first time that day, Elijah was not alone. The burden that does not fade. That night, as the city stretched wide beyond his bedroom window, Elijah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was restless. The video had spread. The world was talking. But the world had always been talking. And when the noise faded, when the headlines changed, when another story replaced this one, would anything be different? Would it be any easier to sit in first class without proving he belonged? Would Naomi stop shrinking in her seat when people looked at her too long? Would his father ever stop preparing for a fight that had begun before he was born? The answer came to him quietly. No, but that did not mean the fight was over. Because the real battle was not about one flight. It was about the next one. And the one after that. And every moment in between. Elijah turned onto his side, his fingers curling into the sheets. There would be more of these moments. There would be more silences to break. More assumptions to shatter. More battles that felt like victories but never quite were. And maybe just maybe one day, he wouldn't have to prove anything at all.